Terence Ho is an associate professor in practice at the Kuan School of Public Policy at NUS. Previously, he was in the civil service, serving in the key roles in the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Manpower, and Ministry of Education. He is also the author of 2 books, the first book being Refreshing the Singaporean System. So he's interesting because he's both a practitioner and someone who actually studies or researches public policy. So Terence, I'd like to welcome you to the show.
Thank you, Keith. Glad to be on the show.
Yeah, so my first question actually was something that I picked up from your first book, which was you actually highlighted President Tharman, President Tharman now, but previously was the senior minister, as someone who has shaped our policy innovations in Singapore. And from my point of view, actually, I see him more as a political leader, right? Because he has been able to articulate really clearly what Singapore's policy positions are on multiple issues. And was able to do so in a very accessible and creative way, right? So we think about the social trampoline. Yes. I wanted to ask you, because you worked with him up close and personal, what makes him a good policy maker?
So I think he was finance minister from 2007 up to 2015, and this coincided with the time that I was in the Ministry of Finance from 2010 onwards. I think he really thinks deeply about issues. He reads very widely to learn from the best practices of other countries, and he's willing to use his influence to really push the needle, with a lot of attention to both the big picture as well as the micro details. So as coordinating minister for social policy as well, I'm sure he was able to use his influence within cabinet to bring about many significant changes in our social policy landscape in Singapore, particularly to strengthen assurance and social security and support for Singaporeans.
Yeah. And if I could just go deeper on that, because you worked with him maybe at a personal level, what made him a great leader in the sense of pushing for policy change?
First of all, of course, he has great intellect and gravitas, very widely read, and hence highly respected both in Singapore and internationally. So when he speaks, of course, his cabinet colleagues and others would definitely listen. Yep. But I think as a leader also, he had this very strong personal touch or connection. I'll give you some examples. So within the Ministry of Finance, for example, he would listen very carefully to what any officer, regardless of their seniority, would have to say. And he would ponder these questions deeply and always come up with a very thoughtful response. So in other words, he respected each person, I think not just within the civil service, but people from all walks of life. Yeah. So that really helped him to to draw in the best ideas, regardless of who originated these ideas, and therefore craft also the most suitable policies for Singapore. And he was willing to break new ground, to sort of question orthodoxy, not to institute a revolution, but rather an evolution of ideas, but one that built up into something significant in terms of reshaping the social policy landscape in Singapore.
I think if you think about talking about the theme of your book, at the start, when you say, Singapore is known for instituting policy by evolution, not revolution, or in a sense, refreshing our policies, I would like to, just quickly ask you, what does that actually mean? What does it actually mean for Singapore to refresh its policies?
So, of course, Singapore's ruling party has been continuous since gaining independence in 1965. So there's bound to be some continuity in terms of political ideology, in terms of policy thinking. But at the same time, circumstances have changed significantly. And I think Singapore's policies too have moved with the times. So what I tried to sketch out in my book is both economic as well as social policy evolution, but with a strong focus on social policy. So we've always held to this core values of self-reliance as encapsulated in this pithy phrase called reward for work, work for reward. I think this still continues, but at the same time, there's recognition that as Singapore becomes a much more high-cost city, there's a need to strengthen the social security and assurances that citizens have. And indeed, over the years, there have been significant strengthening of this social security system, of social insurance or risk pooling, if you like, as well as more transfers, just to make sure that our growth continues to be inclusive. So this is one example where we retain certain core principles of values, but we overlay it and evolve the policy as well to something that keeps up with the times, to ensure that as Singapore develops, progresses, and becomes more expensive, it still remains inclusive for all Singaporeans.
Yeah. What policies have you seen most notably that was innovative on that?
Yeah, so this predates my time in the Ministry of Finance, but of course the introduction of the Workfare income supplement, the wage supplement for the lower income workers, I think that's a very major shift. And I mentioned risk pooling as well. universal healthcare insurance in the form of MediShield Life, as well as our long-term care insurance, and even longevity insurance in the form of CPF Life. These are just some of the measures. And for retirees, of course, there's the Silver Support Scheme, which tops up their sort of income as well. And then we have permanent transfers, such as our GST voucher. So all these add up to something I would say is significant. And more recently as well, we have progressive wages, which is something that helps really to boost the pay as well as take-home pay of our low-income workers. I think these are all significant shifts in our social policy support.
And you talk about progressive wages. I think mainly I would say our own version, or at least of the minimum wage, which was our progressive wage model. I wanted to hear your thoughts a little bit more about what you think about the progressive wage model. I know the policymakers in Singapore think of it as a very nuanced take on the minimum wage, where you're looking at specific sectors. How do I help low-income workers in these specific sectors, some form of income progression, and also achieve social mobility? But I wanted to hear your thoughts on what do you think about the effectiveness of this policy so far?
Yeah, so this policy, I was involved in the early stages of it. It was start off as a very niche policy to address some market failures in cleaning, particularly security and landscaping. So these are sectors that were prone, or rather jobs that were prone to outsourcing, which became cheap sourcing.
Yep.
Because there were these cleaning companies that would vie for contracts, such as cleaning for a particular building, and then they would put in very low bids. And then they would proceed to rehire the same cleaners from maybe another company, but offer them lower wages because they have bid a lower amount. So clearly, the wages of security guards and cleaners stagnated for many years because of these practices. So the progressive wages were introduced to tackle the so-called cheap sourcing. But subsequently, it was realized that there was a great potential to use progressive wages in a much broader way. So to cover significant numbers of the lower income, lower wage workers in Singapore. So it became almost like a sectoral minimum wage, but with some differences. So besides having a wage floor, it also specifies a wage ladder, with the rungs of the ladder corresponding to higher skills, job responsibilities, and productivity. So if you like, it's a Singapore take on the minimum wage. But it's in keeping more with the Singapore governance principle of putting in some effort for reward, because workers are incentivized to upgrade the skills, upgrade the productivity and the job responsibilities in order to qualify for the higher wages.
Yeah. I think so. One of the strengths that I think you rightly point out is that actually also incentivizes companies to undergo some form of business transformation and help them to upskill their worker. But I think one of the critiques, I think, from I think economists such as Linda Lim, I think she highlighted that, in those cases, actually, much of the productivity of the worker is dependent on the firm itself, whether they choose to invest in technology or not, or whether they choose to help upskill their worker. Because at the end of the day, for example, a cleaner is fundamentally constrained not by how fast he or she cleans, but maybe based on the kind of tools that he or she has access to. So in that, what kind of tweaks do you think the government should make to the progressive wage model to kind of further incentivize firms to actually really push the workers up the wage ladder?
Yeah, so to some extent, I think the nexus between productivity and wage can't be a very purist one. And as you pointed out, there are some limits to how much productivity can increase in certain jobs. So part of it is really helping the lower wage workers to catch up with the median. So in other words, narrow the occupational wage gaps. And not all of it would be fully paid for, if you like, by higher productivity. So, the consumers or people in society in general, businesses, consumers, we have to bear the additional costs of a more inclusive society. So I think this is a recognition that the system is not going to be a pure one where any wage gains are purely sort of funded for by higher productivity.
In that sense, do you think Singapore is ready for being an even higher cost society?
Yeah, I think it's inevitable if we want to be a more inclusive society, that we will be a higher cost society. So I think elsewhere in my books I've written about the Singapore location premium, in the sense that for a given level of skills, of course, there will be other people in other countries who could do the same job for less. But being in Singapore, which is a much higher cost city, we all ought to have a wage premium for, just being here. And Singapore's status as a hub for talent capital would add to this premium that we can enjoy for performing various services within Singapore.
Yeah. And actually, I really like the idea of the location premium. I think that's what you talk about as well, which is that, you know, the price of being Singapore, the price of access is actually should be priced in the way we treat our goods and services, right? If I could really turn back time a little bit, what I would say is that it's hard for actually us to imagine Singapore in a time where we weren't that hub. And I wanted to ask you, from your opinion, you know, someone who studies policy, what do you think were the key policies made in the early years of Singapore that set us on this path of becoming an established hub in the world?
Yeah, so the basic prerequisites, of course, for Singapore's economic development were political stability and good governance. But the specific trajectory we took was one of export-oriented industrialization, which took place at a time where it was really successful, and that really set Singapore on the path of development. So I think the main strategy then was to attract multinationals. And why attract MNCs? Because we wanted access to the global markets, to the technology, to the business know-how, to their capital. So what set Singapore apart was really being able to attract MNCs to use Singapore as a cost-competitive manufacturing base. So it so happened at the time the American multinationals, particularly in electronics, were looking for alternative manufacturing bases to be able to compete with their Japanese counterparts. And Singapore was able to offer them the value proposition of having a stable place for manufacturing. They could set up very quickly, and we had all the factors in place for them, or rather we put in place all the factors for them, which included strong connectivity in the form of roads, ports, and airport, in order to be able to export the products to the world. And each of the factors of production were there. So besides infrastructure, of course, we have land, the quick setup of industrial land as well, with all the utilities well provided for. For labor, we had skilled manpower. We trained them specifically to be able to take on these manufacturing jobs. And importantly, industrial harmony, to give the manufacturers the peace of mind that they could continue production and do it at a cost-effective manner. And of course, access to financing as well, and tax incentives. And so this in turn attracted other multinationals, not just from the US, but also the Japanese and Europeans to set up shop here. Yeah. And over the years, we diversified the economy. We moved up the value chain to more capital or knowledge-intensive products. And this virtuous cycle also meant that incomes of Singaporeans rose in tandem. And I mentioned it's a virtuous cycle because this in turn generated the political support for pro-growth economic policies. And the government was also able to get Singaporeans to set aside more savings under the Central Provident Fund. So because of this rapid growth, and this also gave government the resources needed to further invest in infrastructure, in human capital and productivity. And this took place at a time where Singapore was able to ride the wave of globalization. Not necessarily so easy to replicate in another sort of time and age. Yeah. One further factor I would mention is the emphasis on human capital development. Because we know that many countries which are blessed with natural resources, they are subject to the so-called resource curse, where the focus is really on extraction of these natural resources and insufficient attention is given to human capital. But in Singapore's case, because the MNCs were here to tap on the labor force primarily, so they had the same incentive as the government to invest in people, and this laid the foundation for long-term development and success.
In that sense, what you're saying is that the human capital development was actually both from the government and in terms of, I guess, upstream, where they're investing a lot in education at the start, and then downstream would be, I guess, the technical knowledge transfer from these MNCs. And actually, I would like to then, take a closer study of the region, because we look at Singapore and then people say that we're part of that East Asian miracle in the sense that we're like one of the four tigers, right? We have Taiwan, Hong Kong, us, and South Korea. And I wanted to maybe ask you a little bit how we were different from three other counterparts in terms of the socio-economic policy that we developed.
So I think there are quite a few similarities, of course, which is why we're grouped with these tigers in terms of the state-led capitalist model, if you like. But there were some differences as well. I think Singapore relied a lot on the MNCs, whereas some of these other economies, they also had very significant homegrown companies as well. So ours is mainly export-led, MNC-led industrialization, especially in the earlier years. In terms of social policy, I think there are some commonalities again in East Asia. We tended to have sort of smaller state welfare, if you like. But with democratization, I think you can see that in many of these economies as well, the breadth of the social programs and support has also expanded over time. Singapore, perhaps less so than some of these other economies, but gradually, as I previously mentioned, we are adapting to the new reality, and we've had to expand that social net as well.
Yeah. And actually, the way you have conceptualized Singapore actually is, in terms of social welfare, is that you kind of see Singapore as a social investment state, right? A social investment state meaning that we invest in our human capital, and we see it as a form of investment. That's interesting because from my point of view, actually, it seems to me that the government sees itself as a capital allocator in that sense. Like a good example is like, if you think about agencies like Enterprise Singapore and the Economic Development Board, the way they even treat grants and subsidies is almost as if they're looking for a return on the invested capital, right? It's not just a grant that seeks to protect you from foreign competition, but it's the opposite, where we're trying to maybe help you become better, maybe improve productivity, improved innovation, and improved internationalization. So you are able to become a much more competitive firm in the international market. Yes. And then what I wanted to ask, similar in that vein, right, is when you think about social investment, how do you conceptualize this idea of Singapore as a social investment state? And then why did we actually embrace this path, trying to increase social investment as opposed to maybe a more welfare state?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to the ideology or the thinking of our founding generation of leaders, in particular Mr. Lee Kuan Yew as well, who personally saw the effects of having too much welfarism in Europe, which he felt would erode this sense of self-responsibility of the individual and also drain the state coffers. So I think he correctly identified that the long-term sustainable way to have people improve their lives is by increasing their skills, so that they earn their own keep in a sense, and they can provide for themselves and the family. So this is a strong sense of value or ideology that permeates the policies from 1965 and up to today, of course, with some adjustments and tweaks. And therefore, the idea of social investment is to equip the person with the skills needed to take a good job. And the government's role, of course, is to ensure an environment where there are investments, there are opportunities for full employment. And then everyone who puts in the effort, in theory, will be able to get this good job and use his or her skills to earn and provide for himself. Of course, the reality is that the government support is still needed, and has always been from the earliest days. So in terms of healthcare subsidies, in terms of public transport and other areas of life, there is government behind the scenes. But at least in terms of the rhetoric, the emphasis is on the self to provide for that. And so the two key areas where the government was prepared to put in a lot of subsidy right from the beginning was in terms of public housing and education. So education fits into the human capital paradigm I mentioned. But why public housing? Because I think Mr. Lee Kuan Yew also felt that home ownership would be a key part of his vision for Singapore. And that has wider considerations, including the sense of belonging to the nation, having an asset to motivate people to defend the nation, and so on and so forth. So I think with public housing and education, that was where the key priorities for social investment, if you like, were.
Yeah. What other areas do you think in this new age would be under the umbrella of social investment? Are there other areas now? Perhaps maybe it's expanding the kind of level of education that Singaporeans have. Maybe so it could be a broadening of the mandate of social investment, or it could be other areas that you think the government can maybe have more social investment in.
Yeah, so of course within education, the emphasis now is a lot on lifelong learning as well, so through the Skills Future movement. But if you look at other areas, I think we've always spent a lot as well on healthcare, and increasingly so as the population ages. Of course, many Singaporeans are also affluent, but I think the government still has to step in with greater public subsidies given how much healthcare costs have risen. And other areas include public transportation, which also brings a lot of spillover benefits or external benefits, to borrow the economist's lingo. And we've had to strengthen the basic social security as well, and assurance. So the many schemes I mentioned before, from a Workfare income supplement to silver support to the permanent transfers to the greater use of risk pooling or social insurance, all this is a part of providing that assurance. And recently, of course, the government has been talking about unemployment support, the details of which are still being worked out.
So far, we've talked a little bit more, a lot actually about how Singapore has got to where we are. And then I wanted to ask a little bit more about the future in terms of the challenges that we face. So you identified, I think, some of the challenges that Singapore will face in terms of income growth, income security, affordability, inequality, social mobility, and what you say, potential skills underemployment. So I would like to actually, further drill down as to, out of these many challenges, which one do you think is the most important challenge that we really need to tackle as a nation?
Yeah, I would say more than one. So certainly making sure that inequality doesn't rise and sustaining social mobility will be a major challenge, because our growth has always been inclusive, which is why I mentioned there was political support for the growth agenda. And going forward, as there's a risk of so-called social stratification in terms of many affluent Singaporeans now being able to pass on their wealth and other advantages to children, how we keep this as an inclusive society with fair opportunities will be a defining challenge. Yep. The other, of course, is the aging population with slowing workforce growth as well. And so this would be, in a sense, a dampener on the future growth prospects. And we can't just replace the sort of locals with more foreigners, because there are other societal constraints in terms of numbers that we can bring in. So again, how we can ensure that Singapore continues to be at the forefront of technology, continues to be a place where things happen despite having a plateauing workforce growth. I think that would be another significant challenge.
Actually, when I think about the challenges that you laid out, I think one of the things that you pointed out was that in order for meritocracy to continue working, you need social mobility.
Yep.
And actually that's been pointed out by, I think, even economists in the US, where they would say that, hey, Americans' version of meritocracy is not working. And actually when you really look at it and you look at the data, you realize that, the problem actually is that, like what you said, the wealthy are able to hand off, unfair advantages in a sense that prevents the level playing. And then my question naturally, as a follow-on would be, how has Singapore traditionally tackled inequality? I know we're very generous with transfers. We're very generous with transfers and making sure that we're spending a lot more on the lower bottom 20%, as opposed to maybe the middle class. But I'd like to ask a little bit more about, what are the policies that we've enacted in the recent years that have really sought to aggressively tackle this challenge of inequality?
Yeah, so part of it is really to sort of strengthen what we've been doing already. I mentioned the social investment state. But of course, now, as we mentioned, that the wealthy are able to pass on further advantages, even through the education system, through to the children, through private tuition, and subsequently, opportunities in the job market, such as internships from the professional connections. So Singapore has to double down in terms of its investment in people. So there are many interventions at the early childhood level now, whether we have programs such as Kids Start, Uplift, which really focus resources on giving the best start possible to the children from maybe less well-off households. I wouldn't say all of them are disadvantaged households, but certainly less well-off. And so pouring in more resources in giving people opportunities, regardless of family background, is going to be a strategy that has to continue. But beyond that, I think the government is also doing more to sort of directly offset some of the inequality, upward pressure on inequality, such as through the permanent transfers I mentioned, through the GST voucher, Workfare income supplement, and also to uplift wages through the progressive wage model as well. So I think we need all these to act in concert to be able to make sure that inequality is managed, and that this is going to be a society where there's still opportunities for anyone to succeed.
Yeah. So if I could, maybe Now we've really talked about the kind of things that you've studied up close and personal. I wanted to maybe tap on your experience in government as well and ask a few questions that I had, even when I was preparing for this interview. I was particularly interested in your experience as a civil servant, in a sense of governance as a discipline, meaning like people often conflate politics and governance. And you also wrote a book on governing well, which is why I thought I needed to ask that question, right? Which is, what makes a government exceptional, in the sense of what makes a good policy? What are the ingredients you need for a government to be exceptional, especially when you think about the Singapore model?
So first of all, I think that governance and politics can't quite be separated, because we need a sort of conducive political environment in order for long-term policies to be made, in order for governance to be effective. What really characterizes good governance, and this is not just from my personal experience, but also I've been recently talking to many of the veteran public sector and political leaders as part of my interviews for another book. And what really struck me was the emphasis on translation of good policy design into effective implementation on the ground. And that requires really a lot of factors. First of all, it requires the ear to be close to the ground, to know what are the emerging sort of concerns. It requires a very forward-looking view to anticipate what the future challenges could bring, and requires effective communication as well, and design of policy to make it easy to implement, easy to enforce, easy to understand. And there are trade-offs clearly between how fine-tuned your policy is and the complexity, because we want to keep policies sort of basic enough to implement effectively and to be understood, most importantly, for the people, because without the understanding, there can't be support. So the attention to detail all the way from policy design to implementation to the public consultation and communication, all of these are important for good policy making. And no policy is perfect. So this is something another of the pioneer or veteran leaders has shared with me. The basic policy must cater to the needs of 80-90% of the population. And then you need to have mechanisms to deal with the 10% that may fall through the cracks, that may not be fairly treated by the basic policy. And if you can exercise discretion, if you can customize that, solutions for that 10 to 20%, I think then you have a good overall policy mix.
Yep. And how does the Singapore government actually catch the people who fall through the cracks? What are some of the mechanisms that you've seen, maybe in policy settings, that especially when we talk about socio-economic policies, what are some ways that they actually implement, or what are some policies they actually implement to make sure that those who fall through the cracks don't fall too far?
Yeah, so just to raise one example of the Silver Support Scheme, which is meant to top up the incomes of retirees who had low lifetime incomes. So there's a basic policy criteria to determine whether you qualify for the scheme. But the basic criteria may not catch everyone who is deserving of support. So then you have a committee set up, for example, where if you don't qualify, you can appeal to that. And that will look into your individual circumstances, which could be quite different. So the basic policy itself has to be fairly simple, so people know generally whether they qualify or not. But at the margins, we're able to have this, the details being assessed by a panel to determine whether someone will qualify.
Oh, that's a good example. Actually, I think so far you've actually listed two important variables in good governance. One is having your ear close to the ground. Two is actually translating your policy design in a way that allows you to make effective policy for 90% of the population, and then have a mechanism in place that allows you to iterate, and make sure that you can catch the remaining 10%. So outside of these two, are there any other ones that you feel like, it's a must-have in every other in a good government?
Yeah, so I think for the policies themselves, I think we need to be adaptable. So it's not as if you can cook a policy once for all time.
Yeah.
But as circumstances change, you may need to tweak or update the policy. And of course, when operating an environment that is highly uncertain, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, then many of the policies have to sort of change on the go. Yeah. And that sort of nimbleness, I think, is key. To take in new data and to be able to adjust the policies on the fly. Yeah. I think that would be the hallmark of good governance, in fact, because I think that as much as we try to anticipate the future, we can't predict everything that's going to happen. Yeah. So that we need to build in a flexibility, both in terms of policy nimbleness as well as having the resource buffers to enable that kind of flexible changes along the way. Yeah.
But governments are known to be bureaucracies, which make it hard to be nimble, right? So there's a natural tendency towards inertia. I guess the question would then be like, how does the Singapore government ensure that we can remain nimble in that sense?
So Singapore is fortunate in the sense is that we are fairly small. Yeah. So because of that, we don't have, let's say, some other countries, they have a federal and state level governments. And in fact, the political leadership works very closely with the civil servants. But of course, having said that, we need to also guard against growing bureaucracy, which is a tendency in all countries, including Singapore, which is to proliferate more departments, which are an ever-growing complexity, more layers of management and so on, in which case we would spend much of our time sort of briefing or dealing with other agencies and departments rather than actually getting work done. So we still need to guard against that. But I think with our rather small size, if we can keep our our departments and organizations still fairly flat, I think we can achieve that kind of speed of implementation response without getting bogged down in excessive bureaucracy.
Yeah. So maybe the third variable is having a relatively flat hierarchy that allows you to be nimble in that sense, right?
So we need to empower the leaders, the civil servants at all levels to take quick action. So I think this was seen in certainly the pioneer generation of leadership, where Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, of course, devolved a lot of authority and influence to his other members of his team, who in turn trusted the civil servants to get things done. And we can see many examples of very innovative and entrepreneurial actions taken by civil servants as well in order to get the mission accomplished. I think we need that continued bias towards action, willing to sort of challenge the orthodoxy or the status quo in order to get us to the next level. Of course, we must do it judiciously.
Yeah. And are there any stories that you remember from your time or the time before that you were like, wow, this is really an entrepreneurial civil servant?
Many examples. But of course, in my time, things were becoming a little bit harder to move because Singapore has become more successful and we've built up more layers of policy. Anything you do will affect many people, other stakeholders' livelihoods. There will be winners and losers, and there are more departments to sort of coordinate with. So really, you still need a very strong vision to push forward for something. Basically, things only get done when there's a champion. So recently, I was speaking to one of our veteran leaders as well, Prof. Cheong Kun Hien, who is the URA CEO before that, and also HDB CEO, and she really championed things like Gardens by the Bay. And you need this kind of personal advocacy to the political leadership, to push through certain projects which are transformative. Because Gardens by the Bay, if you think about it, it occupies so much prime land. So there are obviously going to be calls for other land users, right? Whether it's for housing, for economic development. So it takes vision to say that, let's set aside this land to make sure that we have something iconic in Singapore that was good for livability in Singapore, as well as put Singapore on the world map.
Yeah. And I actually really like the anecdote that you raised up, because it's an example of entrepreneurship in a sense of advocacy as a civil servant. And it is also something that not most people know, right? Because most people only see the end result. They see, wow, there's Gardens by the Bay, there's movies being filmed there, there's a lot of people coming down. But you don't actually see, actually there's a secret story behind it where you needed someone to really champion it and push for it, like what you said, because we all have a tendency towards the status quo. And then on that note, I wanted to ask you, you're at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. You travel a lot to other countries in Asia to teach governance or to teach policy making, right? So naturally, there must be something that we offer that's valuable in the sense that we are an exporter of intellectual capital. What do you think Singapore actually has been able to teach other parts of the world?
Yeah, so it's natural that many countries want to learn about and learn from Singapore given our sort of economic and societal success story. But I think what's very important to emphasize is always the importance of context. And I mentioned that the main hygiene factors need to be in place, which some countries unfortunately lack, which is the kind of stability. I mean, if you are mired in sort of political instability and in actual conflict, whether hot conflict or cold conflict, or if the whole system is rife with corruption, then many of the other details will not be possible to implement. So as some of the veteran leaders also shared with me, is many countries know what ought to be done. It's just that they can't find the political will to be able to carry it out. Which is why I mentioned Singapore is fortunate to have enter this virtuous cycle at the beginning, where the clear lifting of living standards ensured that the government had, by and large, the broad support of the population to, continue to invest in growth, in productivity, and so on. But this is not so easily achieved everywhere. So once you have the basics in place, then I think the specific policies, you can talk about certain principles and apply some of these principles, of course, adapted to the local context.
Yeah. And then because I know you do teach courses or you teach students from other countries as well, assuming you have those basic ingredients. And we know that actually, because we're such a unique historical anomaly, right? We're a small city-state, we don't have a lot of resources, and we don't have anyone else except for our human capital So in that sense, it's hard to kind of replicate our model. But I would say that, because at the Lee Kuan Yew School, you're really teaching other policymakers overseas, you're doing workshops for them and stuff like that. What's the thing that they're interested about Singapore? Yeah, because from my point of view, I just think, we're so unique that we're so niche in that sense that there really isn't anything much to learn from us in that sense.
So the two areas that they most want to learn, at least in the areas that I cover, are the Singapore's economic development journey, as well as the essence of good governance. But having said that, although Singapore is unique in many ways, and our development took place in a particular point in time, there are certain principles that can be quite universal and applicable, which can be then adapted to the local context. Let me just give some examples on the principles of fiscal governance. So one thing I always try to emphasize, I think this is applicable wherever you are, is to focus not just on how much money you spend, but on the outcomes as well. So this is something quite powerful because I think many countries, if you want to get a sense of how much importance they place in education, they will look, what's the percentage of GDP or my government budget I spend on education. If you want to know whether I'm emphasizing healthcare, we again look at, what's the percentage of GDP I spend in healthcare. But as we all know, there are countries such as the US where there's a huge expenditure on healthcare, but the healthcare outcomes aren't necessarily better. So this begs the next question. If you want to get better outcomes without spending so much, then what are some of the strategies? Again, these are something that are quite applicable in other countries. One is to go upstream where possible. So in other words, if you can invest in, as we talked about earlier, in education, particularly early childhood education, this gives a firm foundation for someone to acquire skills through life and therefore earn better incomes. And likewise in healthcare, it's not just about treatment of disease and acute conditions, which is very important, but also the investment you put in preventive healthcare, healthy living, in screening. And then one of my favorite examples comes from the area of, crime and punishment as well. In Singapore, many foreigners coming here are struck by how we don't seem to have a lot of visible police presence on the road. So we do spend money, obviously, on policing, but it's more to that in terms of lowering the crime rate. So first of all, it's the entire sort of, penal code as well. What are some of the punishments that deter people from committing crime? And beyond that, it's about education and prevention as well. It's about working with youth at risk to prevent them from falling into bad company, getting involved in crime. It's about educating people how to protect themselves from being victims of crime. And all that adds together to give us the good outcomes without having to spend so much money on law enforcement, on policing. So that's an example I'd like to give as well.
Yeah, and when you talk about this, actually it reminds me of what I kind of raised up earlier in the conversation, which was that the government really sees itself as a capital allocator. Because if you're a government or a bureaucracy that's more interested in maybe the optics, then you look at it in terms of, how much do I spend the percentage of my GDP on? But from my point of view, they're really quite obsessed on what's the return. So for a certain investment that I'm making in education, in healthcare, right? If I'm investing, say, 4% of my GDP or government budget in healthcare, what's the return that I'm getting vis-a-vis other countries who are doing the same? And that's really the mind of an investor, right? Because you're always kind of looking at what's the return on my investment.
Of course, some things are less easily quantifiable, so you need to balance the sort of quantitative metrics with other strategic or other things that are maybe not so easily quantified, but also important, and that must factor into our cost-benefit assessment as well.
So what are the things that factor into that cost-benefit analysis? So for example, what you shared about early childhood education, you're investing a lot of money in it. What are the outcomes that the government measures or tracks?
Yeah, so obviously the one key aspect of investing in skills, it must be eventually the return in terms of incomes that people receive. So that data is easily obtainable. But of course, education is more than just earning potential. It's also about citizenship values, and it's about personal fulfillment as well. So I think we need to factor everything in, both the sort of quantifiable aspects as well as the softer aspects. Earlier, I gave the example of Gardens by the Bay. Of course, one could have proxies for the value of the gardens in terms of economists and people who do cost-benefit analysis would say that one way to measure that impact is to look at property prices next to the greeneries of the parks versus equivalent property further away. That's a good proxy, but of course can't capture the entire intangible value. And I would say that, just to add on to one of the points, if I may, while we need civil servants and political leaders who are able to push the vision, in terms of developing the Esplanade, Gardens by the Bay and all that, there's another very important aspect of leadership and governance, which is going to be completely unseen. There's people who are able to think ahead of things that might go wrong and to take steps to correct it before it erupts. And unfortunately, there's a paradox here because nobody is ever going to get the credit for averting a major disaster. Once something major happens, like oil spill off our southern coast, or maybe recently, this is not in Singapore, but the global IT outage, caused by something that went wrong, you can see the impact is going to affect millions of people, billions of people. The costs are staggering. But the small actions that people take behind the scenes to avert the disaster are things that are probably undervalued but a critical part of governance. And I think in this regard, we have probably done quite well in the area of security. This is something that Singapore naturally would not want to emphasize too much because we would want to become even more of a target. But there's a lot of good work behind the scenes to nip things in the bud, to prevent a major attack or something, a disaster from happening. And this will never be sort of seen or given due credit.
It's like you need to be the man in black behind the scenes, right?
Yes.
And if you have one example that you think really drives home this point of preventative work, I think we see in healthcare right now, there's a huge drive towards preventative healthcare. But you've pointed out security. But if there was like one kind of policy that strikes out to you as, wow, this is something that actually saved us maybe billions of dollars, what would that be?
Yeah, so I think these examples are everywhere. I can't really point to one, but maybe I would just expand earlier on what I mentioned about preventing a terrorist attack. Of course, it's impossible to be foolproof, but there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes in terms of rehabilitating people at risk, in terms of getting community support, to even get people to look out for things that are suspicious, people who may be influenced by extremist ideologies. And that takes a lot of hard work behind the scenes. Yeah, and then in terms of equipment, monitoring, checks, in terms of audits, there's a lot of work that has to go on to notice when there's some irregularity or something that may go wrong and alert people to this risk.
And now if I could, I wanted to ask a little bit more about your time in the Ministry of Finance, where you were the director. When you were director there, and you had to basically figure out how to spend $19 billion across 5 years to help improve our national research. What's the process like from your point of view? Like, how do you actually I have a pool of money here. Like, what's the best way to spend this money? How do you kind of approach it?
So of course we don't start with a blank slate. So we have this 5-year budget, which is roughly pegged at 1% of GDP for public spending on research, innovation, enterprise. But we do have an installed base of our research institutes, of our faculty in our universities, in our teaching hospitals. So there are ongoing programs that would form the sort of basis for the next 5-year tranche. And of course, we need to make sure that we reallocate every time there's 5 years because there may be new emerging priorities. And that could mean sort of deprioritizing some areas and channeling funds into new emerging areas. And we always leave behind some white space for even within the 5 years that new priorities and new opportunities may emerge, and we must be able to have some dry powder, so to speak, to tap on. In the middle of any 5-year program, it's important to have a review to find out what is working well, what not so well, so that we can then do some rechanneling. So although Singapore, $19 billion for that previous tranche of might seem like a lot of money, in the grand scheme of things, worldwide, it's a drop in the ocean, right? So Singapore cannot be doing everything in terms of basic or applied research in every area because we are just too small players. So we need to play, in a sense, to our strengths. And we always have this question of whether to buy something that we need or to build something. So there are many considerations both for our economy and for our society why we need to look at certain research here. Some research would help our companies gain or capture certain economic opportunities and maybe establish themselves as world leaders. So we invest in those areas. And there's some unique societal needs that maybe we can't buy everything off the shelf. So for example, even the area of human health, much of the research and drugs maybe are developed with, for example, Westerners in mind. So we need to adapt some of these to the tropical situation that we face here. And we need to put in more money in tropical disease research if we think there's not enough being done on the global scale to meet our particular needs of our local population. So these help to inform what are the 4 maybe priority areas that we have identified under research, innovation, enterprise. But we are still not confining ourselves to these 4 focus areas, but leave some, white space, dry powder to tap other opportunities that may arise.
Yeah.
So I think that's the broad thinking about how to allocate the money.
Yeah, and I think in the recent years, Singapore has really emerged as a very strong R&D hub for medicine, advanced medical technologies. We've seen some companies emerge as possible global players. I think if we think about what you shared earlier about finding the areas that Singapore can really play an important role in, especially like what you shared in the tropical areas, that is something that actually, from just my personal experience talking to like people who moved all the way to Singapore from other parts of the world, they shared that was one of the key incentives for them, which is that you have a chance to really experiment and go into new areas that are previously untapped, just because you're so small. In that sense, and
also we have very good data that you can work with here, right?
Oh, in what sense? What
because we have very strong data collection in terms of the healthcare indicators of the population. If you're a researcher, this is like a gold mine as well. Yeah. Of course, we protect the individual identities, but if you look at aggregate anonymized data, there's plenty of room to work with.
That's fascinating to know as well. That upside of being a hub is that one, you have a lot of data that you collect, and also our obsession of data collection has actually made us useful to researchers all across the globe. Another area that I really was quite intrigued by was that you actually worked at the City Development Council,
Community Development Council.
Community Development Council. Sorry, so they're led by mayors in Singapore. And you've run and operated one. I wanted to ask you, what's the value proposition of a Community Development Council? It's because you've worked in it. And also, like, Singapore is so small. Do we need 5 mayors?
So the role of the CDCs has evolved over time. I think they were set up in the late 90s, and I was the GM around the 2004 to 2007 to 2009. So at the time, we had a triple mission encapsulated by ABC. So A is assisting the needy. So we administer the social assistance to help needy families. B is bond the people, and C is connect the community. So the social assistance role has been transferred to the MSF's social service offices now, so we no longer perform that. But the CDCs are still key sort of conveners of programs that are at the district level rather than at the individual constituency level. So larger scale community bonding programs, initiatives are there. And one of the key roles is to connect different stakeholders for social good, whether it's the schools, the voluntary organizations, which today are known as social service agencies, and different grassroots organizations and partners. They can convene them, they can bring them together to launch programs that can benefit the people. I think that's the main role. As for the mayors, they are unlike mayors in other cities and countries where they have more municipal responsibilities. Our mayors are a bit more like super MPs in the sense that they're responsible for these programs, which I mentioned. So they convene the other MPs within the district and coordinate some of the efforts. And there are things that the CDCs themselves jointly develop, such as the CDC vouchers, which many Singaporeans receive as part of the government cost of living assistance package. And individual mayors, I would say, they're all MPs. Some of them in the past, they would also be the chairman of the town council. So in which case, they will have more of the typical municipal responsibilities. But by and large, the mayor is basically someone who oversees these sort of district level community bonding initiatives. So I would say they do have a value add, perhaps not as indispensable as maybe some other roles.
Yeah, okay. Closing questions. So I think you studied governance in depth for both Singapore and beyond. So if I'll ask you, like, what are the top three leaders in government of all time, just like for the sake of fun, who will you nominate?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that my top 3 is a result of a systematic analysis of all the leaders in many countries, many of whom I'm not familiar with. So I'm just going to name a few names, which obviously reflects my bias and knowledge being from Singapore. So I think clearly one of them would be our founding Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew. I think his story is well known in terms of acquiring the global recognition as the someone who transformed Singapore from the 1960s to the place it is today. But I think beyond Lee Kuan Yew, of course, his other right-hand man, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, is definitely worth counting among my top 3 at least. And I mentioned that I've been talking to many of the veteran public sector and political leaders for their stories of what it took to transform Singapore. And almost invariably, all of them would look up to Dr. Goh as being either the mentor or someone who really inspired them. And for them, coming from so many different domain sectors to all point to the one man means there's really something special about him. And I think he is rightly credited as being Singapore's economic architect and also the architect of our Singapore Armed Forces, National Service, and so on and so forth. So I would say Dr. Goh's contributions are quite wide-ranging, and he deserves to be alongside Mr. Lee Kuan Yew as one of my top 3 leaders. And the third one, I think, is very well known, of course, internationally, Deng Xiaoping from China, credited with opening up China's economy to have a market economy with socialist characteristics, in the process lifting nearly 800 million people out of poverty and transforming China into the world's factory and the economic powerhouse that it is today.
So Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, and Deng Xiaoping. Yeah, that's a fascinating
I'm excluding the sort of wartime leaders,
Yeah.
obviously, who had great heroics in World War II. These are more of the people who transformed the economy and society in largely peacetime.
And that's fine. There's no right answer. I think, top 3. Everyone has their own top 3.
Sure,
Who's your favorite athlete, right?
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thought experiment. And Dr. Goh is one of the more fascinating characters or architects that I've been really studying, because he's been so instrumental at the start of Singapore's journey, and I hope more people do know and find out about him. Next question, I think there are 3 books. If you had to recommend 3 books to your students or to a Singaporean who wants to be a better citizen of the world, what would the 3 books be?
That's another very difficult question because there's so many excellent books out there.
Yeah, but the constraint it helps. The constraint helps.
Yeah, so I think one of the books that left an impression on me, I think is also on many other people, is Thinking Fast and Slow by the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman. And really, it gets us to question to re-examine our cognitive biases for better or more informed, at least, decision-making, even though we may not change the decisions we make. It gets us to be sort of more self-aware. And I think as global citizens, all of us, whether in Singapore or elsewhere, need the kind of reflectiveness. Another book, I would say, but again, this is more representative of a class of books rather than the book itself, is Tuesdays with Morrie by Mitch Albom. But really any book that gets one to sort of reflect on one's life, on issues of death, and one's contribution or place in the world, I think that's well worth reading. So I think the final book is maybe not just one book, but 3 books. Is actually a book you're very familiar with, George Hill's Musings. Because through his musings, he reflects a lot on his thoughts on different cultures and civilizations. I think it's quite mind-expanding for Singaporean to understand and appreciate different histories, cultures, civilizations, and so that we can become more informed and appreciative global citizens. So I'd say those 3 books.
Be fast, but what's the best piece of advice that you ever acted on?
Yeah, so this is, again, advice I don't think came from a single person, but something either I read or someone told me, was that I think we need to, in this day and age, focus on our strengths and not just our weaknesses. Of course, if there are weaknesses in our personal lives or any other area, we try to shore them up. But really, most of our attention should be building up our strengths. In other words, the key areas that we think we can make a difference and contribute to others. And that way, I think collectively as a community, as a society, if we focus on developing our strengths, our unique contribution, collectively, I think we'll all be much better off.
Last question, which is, you have to bring a friend from overseas, who never visited Singapore before, and you have to bring them to one place in Singapore as an introduction. Where would that place be?
So this is something that I know personally many people have done, is to bring them to the Pinnacle at Duxton. So I think that would give them a really nice view of the city and also explain Singapore's unique context in the sense of how public housing has been so important in Singapore's societal development, and to show how far we've come in terms of how we provide that public housing.
So the Pinnacle at Duxton acts as a way to kind of do a public education of HDB, but at the same time some sightseeing.
Yes.
That's actually a very unique answer, I would say. Yeah, so with that, I'd like to thank you, Terence. Thank you for taking the time to come on the show.